the invitation and the introduction. So, as you already said, the paper is titled "Closing the Rent Index Gap by Quantitative Approach to Rental Sector Gentrification," and it was recently published in the TESC as part of this special issue on bridging the rent gap, new theoretical and empirical narratives. I have to say it was not originally drafted for that, but I think the engagement with the special issue overall topic and feedback from that side really was good for the development of the article, and I'm very happy now to also be able to present here in this lecture series. And beside the task and the special issue, the paper is also part actually of my dissertation that I recently defended earlier this year, called "Gentrification in Segmented Housing Markets, Vienna between Rental Market Transformation and Social Housing." So if you're interested in that, you can also find the other articles at the heart of the dissertation online, as well as the library of TU Vienna. So much to advertisement. Let's dive into the topic. So generally, with respect to gentrification, there are many different approaches, definitions, explanations, a whole variety of research. However, Neil Smith's rent gap theory remains still today really a key concept in the literature. And it's still invoked to understand various contemporary urban phenomena, for example, the practices of huge institutional investors like Blackstone, for example, or also sharing and platform economy developments with respect to Airbnb and things like this. And even is extended to dynamics of land use change and uneven geographical development in capitalist societies, much more general. So application way beyond the original gentrification context, let's say. However, I think there is really a lack of literature on operationalizing and measuring rent gaps. There are a few notable exceptions, like, for example, from Ernesto here, as well as other researchers, but I think this really remains a challenging task. And since we know that gentrification theory is very much interested in these rent gaps, we should really put more emphasis in trying to measure, operationalize them in some way. However, yeah, this is still scarce in the literature. Today, I will not only talk about rent gaps and operationalization, but specifically about the rental market context. So let's quickly dive into that. In European cities, tenure conversion has often been seen as actually the key kind of gentrification mechanism, often studied under the so-called value gap framework, which is, let's say, related but not identical to the rent gap framework. There's a great article, I think, by Clark, who does the comparison there. And in a context of a political situation of neoliberal policies and kind of a shift actually towards home ownership, this tenure conversion was really at the center of a lot of research. However, currently, private rental markets, at least in Europe, but I think also beyond, are actually regaining importance. And so I think it's very valuable to actually look at that in more detail. A lot of, especially more liberalized housing markets talk a lot about the generation rent and kind of the unaffordability of purchasing a home. these days. And I believe that the private rental sector is still understudied in the context of the rent gap, which is kind of funny because of the linguistic proximity, but of course rent gaps are by no means limited to rental market, but occur beyond that. There we kind of beware that we are not actually confusing like the contract or housing rent with the ground rent. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I think studying gentrification in rental markets is also from a social relevance important, because I think direct displacement is most likely in the private rental segment. So one of the most severe outcomes of gentrification, so direct displacement, is most likely to be found there, I would argue. Thus, this paper aims to actually analyze rent gap-induced gentrification, where the property is transformed but remains private rental, so no tenure conversion or such involved. And I will refer to this type of gentrification, let's say, by the term rental sector gentrification, that was coined by Millard Ball, who actually, I think, didn't really like the rent gap framework, but nonetheless, yeah, put forth an interesting discussion and, let's say, invented this term. So generally, the paper aims to propose a framework for the quantitative identification of neighborhoods which are transformed through landlords seeking to close existing rent gaps, but where in the end the property remains on the private rental market. And I will exemplify the framework I propose, drawing on the case of Vienna after the 2008 global financial crisis till basically the COVID time, so kind of the between crisis period, one could say. First of all, what do I mean by the term gentrification? Here I again refer to Clark, who defines gentrification as a process involving change in the population of land users, such that the new users are of a higher socioeconomic status than the previous users, together with an associated change in the built environment through a reinvestment of capital. So this is a very typical supply-sided explanation of gentrification that is not so much focused on like cultural processes in a neighborhood, but really on the role of capital in transforming it. And the probably most central and most famous supply-sided theory of gentrification would then, of course, be the rent gap theory by Smith, who suggests that actually this kind of capital reinvestment is triggered by what he calls rent gaps, which is simply the spread between an actual capitalized ground rent under present use and potential ground rent under the best use of the property. In a nutshell, a bit simplified saying, as a landlord, if you're in the long run can make more money, extract more rent by somehow transforming a property, then you will do this in a capitalist society, of course. And rent gaps simply represent an economic incentive here for this transformation. And if such a transformation is successfully done, we say that the rent gap is partially or fully closed. And the closing of rent gaps typically then results in various forms of displacement. I will get back to that a bit later. So the central category at the heart of the rent gap theory is ground rent, which is understood as a claim made by the landowners on the use of their land. And it generally varies with the competitive advantage associated to different qualities of said land. This could be either due to natural features of the land or by improvements that are made to the land, which could be from the public side, for example, through provision of public infrastructure in the vicinity of the property, but could also be, for example, through the investment into the housing stock or the built environment on top of that land, which is kind of the key thing for Smith's argument in the first place. And with respect to rent gaps, we have really a measurement issue because the rent gap itself is not observable. And I think there is a relative broad consensus in the literature that measuring it is a difficult task. And there is a set of studies that tries to do it nonetheless by using some kind of proxies for the capitalized potential ground rent and the actual ground rent. And then you can compute the spread, of course. But up till this day, there's no real consensus on how to properly do this. And was a notorious critic of the rent gap theory actually provided with respect to kind of early papers trying some operationalization. He provides a in-depth criticism there, and then also points out, interesting that actually in Smith's own empirical work, the rent gap also hardly appears. And I think the rent gap framework is a good framework, but was kind of right that this was an kind of indicative thing for a wider trend in empirical gentrification research, namely that the rent gap was kind of popular in theory and literature review sections, but not so much in actually the empirical work. And this is really problematic because we know from several studies, like from Barton or Finio, that empirical gentrification research and their findings are very sensitive actually to the underlying definitions and operationalizations they use. So if we know that our outcome is very sensitive on those factors, we should at least have a very good argument, a good theoretical basis on why we say a certain area is gentrifying or not. However, as noted already, the quantitative gentrification literature I reviewed actually had no real focus on the rent gap in this context. I found some studies that did like an ad hoc identification. For example, the famous Freeman and Bacconi article, they just tell you basically, we have local knowledge, we know these and these areas are gentrifying, and we just compare them to the rest of the city. Or there are purely socioeconomic approaches that would better fit in a kind of demand-sided explanation of gentrification, like, for example, the Atkinson article. And then we have a set of mixed strategy articles that actually combine some kind of real estate and socioeconomic data. For example, the gentry map approach from Holm and Schultz, which we also replicated with some variation for the Viennese context. And I do believe that actually all those approaches provide some valuable insights into the geography of neighborhood transformation. But in many cases, they kind of presuppose the socio-spatial implications. And I think one of the nice things actually about supply-sided theories of gentrification is that they allow to conceptually distinguish, disentangle the drivers of gentrification and the outcomes in a socio-spatial sense. So acknowledging that the direct measurement of rent gaps is quite difficult, but nonetheless, I want to propose a theoretically grounded identification methods for gentrification or potential gentrification areas that are somehow in the spirit of a supply-sided explanation of gentrification. I think we first need to narrow things down a bit. And doing this, I draw on what Bernd called the realization problem. So basically the link between reinvestment of capital in the gentrification context and potential displacement outcomes could describe it also as kind of the key mechanisms of gentrification. And so I would say the first possible mechanism I find in the literature is that the capital reinvestment leads to a total change in the residential nature of a property, and thereby automatically basically displaces all the residents. If you have a residential building there and you tear it down, you put some shopping mall there, then you displace automatically all the tenants who live there. You could have, as a second mechanism, the tenure conversion. So basically, you have a rental housing unit and you change it to an, you sell it off, and it's now like an owner-occupied unit. Then this will be probably unaffordable for most prior tenants, and thereby also having a displacement effect. As already noted, this is typically analyzed under the term value gap. And then third, and most importantly for me here, the property can also be transformed, but then be resupplied on the private rental market at a higher price, thus less affordable. And this third type of gentrification, or I refer to as rental sector gentrification. And the key mechanisms at play here is the qualitative upgrading of the property, of the housing unit, with the aim to attract more affluent tenants that are then able to pay more rent, allows the landlord or the landowner to extract more ground rent. And there is also a second possible related mechanisms that would be the transformation of the built structure that allows the owner to then bypass some sort of rent regulation. So basically the aim is not to attract more affluent tenants, but to just circumvent some kind of regulation to extract more rent from the tenants in place. And quite generally here, again, it's important to distinguish between the concept of housing or contract rent, which is only one component, one potential component of ground rent. But in the specific case of this rental sector gentrification, Smith himself points out that in the case of rental housing, the landlord's capitalist ground rent returns mainly in the form of house rent paid by the tenants, which makes it easier for me or for us to come up then with an operationalization to narrow things down here. And so basically, rising rents are a necessary implication of rent gap closings in the context of rental sector gentrification. So how do we go about measuring this then? I already said rent increases are necessary but not a sufficient condition for the rental sector gentrification. We also need to have this tie to a sort of qualitative transformation. So the higher costs need to be not an outcome of just pure inflation, but somehow linked to a qualitative transformation. And this transformation needs to be what I call price effective, thus able to actually impact rents charged at a later point. So basically, if I only repaint the house from blue to green and tenants or potential tenants are indifferent to the color, then this is a transformation, but it really doesn't change any sort of rent extraction. And again, the transformation can either be a qualitative upgrade or just a transformation that allows me to bypass existing regulation. And to come up now with a measurement for all this, I draw on the literature on housing price indices and hedonic regression, as for example summarized by here 2013. So we make kind of a jump in the literature from this gentrification rent gap literature to the much more technical hedonic house price index and regression literature at this point. So basically what the literature here proposes is the easiest way to measure any price change, of course, is by a mean price index that allows to track the change of the average price level. So basically, I say the average level at this year, I computed, I divide by the average level 10 years ago, and then I get a number that tells me, okay, prices increased on average by, I don't know, 50% in that time span. However, the mean price index is easy to interpret and compute, but it does not distinguish between price and quality signals. So basically that's a thing that classical economists would then criticize and say, you're confusing two different things here. And this kind of motivated the hedonic double imputation method, which is based on a hedonic regression model and allows to construct quality adjusted housing price indices that synthetically track a constant product basket across time. So the idea of any kind of classical price index is that you have a product basket, let's say that consists of butter and bread or something like this. And you can go to the shop every day, every year, and you can check the price of those goods. And then you compare this fixed set of products across time, and they have roughly the same quality over time. So this doesn't really change much. However, with respect to housing, it's actually difficult to observe the prices of a given set of houses again and again over time because they are not traded very often. So it's hard to actually compare the same houses again and again in a systematic way, which would lead to a pure identification of a price signal. And so the idea is we use a hedonic regression model to impute a synthetic price for those observation or for those houses that we are actually not observing all the time, and we make them theoretically available, those prices. And this difference between the mean price and those quality adjusted prices was kind of the motivation for me to come up with the idea of this index gap, which is just simply the spread between the quality adjusted and the non-adjusted index, and should serve as an indication for qualitative upgrade. And the nice thing about this approach is that it avoids any exogenous definition of what constitutes an upgrade. Is a blue house nicer than a green house? I don't know. However, if I regress the price of houses, or in this case, regress different rents on, let's say, if we want the color of the house, then we get an direct estimate of the relationship there. And all the effects I will obtain here then imply actually a price effectiveness of this qualitative change. So I will just briefly touch upon this formula. So basically there are three main quality adjusted price index. The classical version would be a Lapierre index, which tracks the initial set of housing units available at the start period and compares them to the synthetic counterparts at the end of the period, whereas the Paasche index just turns it around and compares the current set of housing units to and kind of traces them back in time. And then the Fisher index is just the geometric mean of those previous two, and is generally considered as kind of the best version of a price index. The mean index, again, as already noted, is just the average price today divided by the average price in the initial period. And then the index gap is a spread between the unadjusted and the adjusted index is just the mean index minus the Lapierre index. And how does this now help me in identifying potential gentrification areas, or as I call it here, gentrification pressure? I propose a very simple method here that definitely could also be refined further. I just say, let's do a bivariate mapping of those two indices that I just suggested to then map neighborhoods that experience a significant transformation as measured by the index gap and a subsequent high rent increase as measured, for example, by the Fisher index. And then I want to plot the terciles of both indices at the end of the observed period. And I say that areas that are in both the top terciles of those indices are considered under high gentrification pressure. Here, I implicitly use the citywide development as kind of a point of reference. Alternatively, we could definitely also employ some sort of absolute borders. We could say, okay, the index has to be, I don't know, above 20 percentage points to say we are kind of on threat of gentrification or so. However, this may vary strongly from like between different contexts. So after developing this theoretical and methodological framework, I want to jump briefly into the motivation of the case study, which will be in Vienna. Most people who do kind of housing research would probably not think of Vienna is a typical gentrification case. It's traditionally rather known for social housing provision and an emphasis on social cohesion policies, rather low levels of socio-spatial inequality. However, also Vienna has experienced a strong real estate price and investment boom, basically in the post-GFC context. And we really had like more than doubling of the real estate prices in that time, and also steep rent increases, also in a time with low inflation and low actual wage increases. And this situation then led to a growing interest actually in gentrification, but a disagreement on the cause and extent of the phenomena. So at least in the academic community, so there are contributions, for example, by Musil et al. In urban geography, or Kadi and Berlich, also Kadi and Matznetter could be mentioned here. And also interesting for the framework I propose is that we actually have a very large rental sector, and we have a complex set of regulations in place, which is key if we want to study also this kind of mechanism that's not just upgrading a property, but also transforming it in a way that allows to bypass regulations. The data I'm using here to compute the indices I suggested is actually listings data, which is not ideal, but often the best thing we have in place. So it actually allows me to only track kind of what's currently going on in the market and no adjustment from kind of old contracts to the market level. However, I have like over 100,000 listings available for the study, and they're covering, of course, housing, rents, as well as various apartment characteristics and exact locations of the rental units. And the data was kindly provided by the data science service company, as well as my research unit at TU Vienna. I use this data now in the next step to actually come up with to estimate this regression model that then allows me to impute the synthetical prices to then compute the price indices. So to develop this model, I have to consider several technical issues. I will just briefly touch upon them. So basically, the literature recommends a semi-log specification. So we log our dependent variable. We should consider some nonlinear relationships, for example, between the size of the flat and then the rent charged. We should consider spatial heterogeneity. For example, having a balcony at your flat might be very important and very price increasing in a central area and less price relevant in a in the outskirts of the city, because there you have all the green space available anyway. Let's say just as a potential case. Then spatial dependency in this kind of spatial data is always a big issue, and then also time variation in the shadow prices, so that kind of relationship between the hedonic characteristics and the prices on the other side might vary over time as well. And then there, besides these technical issues, some Vienna-specific considerations, mainly that we have two regulatory regimes in the Viennese rental market. So one open market segment, the Mietrechtsgesetz Teilanwendungsbereich, basically applicable to housing units that have a building permit post Second World War. And we have a price-regulated segment where we have a complex set of regulations governing the rents that a landlord is allowed to charge. And this is basically applicable to all the housing units that were erected with a building permit prior to 1945. So we need to consider that as well. And I found that the so-called hierarchical generalized additive model framework provided a very flexible tool to actually develop a model for this context. So the data I used has as a dependent variable the rents per square meter logged here, and then I regress it on the size of the flat, the age of the building, the public transportation quality. There is a time factor. There is an effect for the district as well as the sub-district, which will be my unit of analysis. Then we have the number of rooms within the flat. We have the floor level, and we have several dummy variables for balcony, elevator, cellar, garage attached, different types of heating systems, the overall condition of the flat, whether there is a second bathroom, and also what the data provider was. And instead of going now into the mathematical details of the model, I want to rather show you just two figures that kind of should give an idea on how the model actually works. So what we see here on the y-axis is the rents per square meter for a median unit. We have on the x-axis one of the explanatory variables, which would be the area. And then we see kind of the relationship between the rents per square meter and the area. And we see that the relationship really significantly varies between the different districts of Vienna. And it also varies between the open market and the regulated market segment. And then this relationship I just showed you also varies, not to a very strong, but to a certain degree also over time. This can all be tracked by the model that's kind of in the background here. And what I just wanted to note in it is that it's very flexible and therefore a good tool for these price imputations. However, it's not a black box tool like a machine learning approach, for example, where there's no interpretational meaning anymore of the different coefficients and relationships. So after calibrating the model, I use the model to impute the prices, and those imputed prices I then use to construct neighborhood level price indices, as I told you earlier. And so let's jump into the results there. Basically, the index development between 2011 and 2020 is here depicted on the right side. We have the median subdistrict as the thick black line, and then all those lines represent basically one subdistrict. And on average, or in the median, we have a 14% increase in the quality adjusted rent, which these days, it sounds rather laughable because we have now experienced rather high inflation. However, this really needs to be interpreted in the context of a period with very, very low inflation and also rather stagnating wages. And what I also find is that there's a significant variation across the city from slightly negative trends to plus 27% increase in this quality adjusted rent. And what we also see is that there is kind of an increase in the growth rate from about 2017 onwards. If we look at the index gap, the median index gap is of around 20 percentage points. And again, there is significant variation from around slightly negative index values to up to 90 percentage points, which is really a huge value. And what we also observe is kind of a steady growth in the index gap. If we now do the bivariate mapping and we plot it here, we get this picture, and we see that if the color of the subdistrict turns more towards blue, we have a higher index gap, and if it turns more yellow, then we have a particularly high rent increase. And if we overlay this, we might end up with this dark green color, which would be then a case of potentially high gentrification pressure in those areas. So what does the map or this picture tell us? I find 20 neighborhoods with high gentrification pressure, and generally central areas show rather low transformation activity compared to the rest of the city, despite having some clusters of actually high rent growth. However, it appears that kind of this typical transformation in the context of gentrification might have already happened in those areas prior to the study period. However, interestingly, neighborhoods outside the city center have a much higher transformation activity, and this means that traditional working class neighborhoods are often affected here. And this is actually very much in line with other studies who did some mapping with different methodology and different theoretical framework, like, for example, colleagues of Musil et al. And they also find a similar trend towards like more outward moving transformation and gentrification dynamics. So to wrap things up finally, the paper generally advocates for greater reliance on supply-side gentrification theories when empirically identifying gentrification areas. It, however, does not, and this is important, try to directly measure rent gaps. but it aims to theoretically link the closing of rent gaps to more tangible outcomes in the housing market, which are then operationalization. I don't get it. Yeah, you know what I mean? This is then done by the price indices to obtain measurable implications of the rent gap closings given a certain mode of gentrification, which in this case would be then the rental sector gentrification. And in this context, I propose a novel method for quantifying price-effective qualitative transformation based on hedonic price indices and regression modeling. And the cool thing about this is, I think, that this is done without relying on a subjective measure, judgment of what constitutes a quality grade or downgrade. So this is done endogenously. And the whole framework is basically able to investigate, I would argue, any setting where the mechanisms I discuss are actually at play. However, we also need to note that different contexts may have different modes of rent gap closings, and only if really those mechanisms I talked about are at play, then we can apply the method. So that's it from my side. Thank you for the attention and the invitation, and I'm happy to discuss.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I think it's very difficult for me, at least for me, to understand such a sophisticated explanation of all the kind of economic concept within such a short period of time. I mean, it's also like contradicts to the image I had about Vienna. So in Ireland, at least, it's being promoted as an example that their housing market should evolve or even should follow some sort of successful lessons to replicate there. So it's kind of, I think you present some sort of like useful lessons here. I also like the way you try to operationalize the kind of rent gap and try to bring this kind of analysis to gentrification studies. I think for a lot of people working on the same topic, they would be very jealous of the data you actually have for such a extended period of time. So do you have like one short question? I'm just going to ask, and then I'm going to pass on to Ernesto if he can speak. So in earlier,
I would like to address a question, if you let me.
Okay, I'll just ask one short question, and then I'll pass on to you, and then we can collect some questions from the audience. So in the introduction, when you talk about the kind of gentrification theories, rent gaps, you also talk about displacement. I was wondering how that kind of displacement works out in Vienna, and by what kind of using this kind of understanding this kind of index gap, can they help us to understand the kind of displacement as well? And then there's one minor question in one of the slides. You were talking about that kind of a rapid increase around 2017. I was wondering why around 2017. What was the kind of trigger behind that?
Yes, so on the displacement side of things, so of course in this paper I do not really talk about displacement. I try to deal kind of with the economic and socio-spatial side of things in like separate manners, let's say. So here we just see where there is pressure coming from kind of transformation dynamics, which could then displace people. And in other studies I and several colleagues did on Vienna, we actually find that there is, on the greatest urban scale, we don't see much happening, actually. So basically, for example, we did a paper recently published also in Urban Geography, where kind of one of the takes is that there is no real larger suburbanization of poverty as a potential outcome of gentrification. However, this does not mean that there is kind of no negative impact for tenants in those transforming neighborhoods, because they actually still, of course, have to pay the higher rents. And what we also see is that they have much higher relocation rates. So they, because the private rental sector in Vienna has, compared to the more social housing segments that are much more famous, in the private segment, we have much shorter contracts. And so basically, households are moving way more often, but we see a pattern that they often then relocate to areas where, again, the private rental segment is dominant. So kind of there is a certain degree of entrapment, because when you're always on the move every few years and you don't have much savings, then it's kind of hard to get out of the circle, and accessibility barriers into the social housing segments play a crucial role here. And also, of course, that the city is really growing at a strong rate, and that the social housing segments are just not able to suck up all this demand pressure, basically, that's coming in. So generally, socioeconomic or a socio-spatial inequality in the city is not hugely increasing. There's no big suburbanization of poverty. However, what we see is that the poor areas, status-wise, are kind of drifting away from the rest of the city. So kind of there's an absolute change here at play, but there is no huge change in the spatial dynamics, let's say. With respect to 2017, it's a good question. I've not really put too much thought on it. It may be that this just kind of a delayed effect, that kind of reinvestment was kind of happening already, but it takes some time to actually transform, to materialize in really the rents. But this is just speculation, so I don't have a really empirically sound explanation right now.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, Ernesto?
Hi, yes. Congratulations for this fantastic talk.
Thank you.
I think it was your fantastic paper. I apologize for not turning on my camera because I'm in the kitchen with my kids here. But I've been listening. I read your work. I applaud and I admire your sophisticated econometric models that you apply. So I have two questions. The first one is more maybe a comment or a reflection, but given that you say, even though you use these very sophisticated models, you basically say that rent is housing quality plus location. You read that, you wrote that in your presentation. So my question is, since you control the quality of housing, you basically can observe the rest. So my question is, isn't this a model to observe and isolate rent, assuming that rent is basically location, assuming that we are not seeing any kind of absolute rent, monopolistic rent, nothing like that, just differential rent due to location? So I'm not saying that you observe that. I'm saying that maybe your model allows us to focus on ground rent. That's the problem that Neil Smith posed, to my views, but never was really able to do, to demonstrate this different compositions of the housing rent value, which part of it comes from housing quality and the other part comes from location. I think this separation is plenty of connotations for more liberal housing economies, not like Viennese housing economy, but in many other parts, most of the rest of the world. I think local governments and the states have to deal with the need to collect more land value capture from the formation of rent due to land rent. So this is my first reflection on your work.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I have, if you forgive me for this long reaction, but the second question I have is, what do you think about the concept of closing the rent gap? Because one sees your analysis and your data, and housing rents just grow with more intensity if you not control the housing quality, with less intensity if you do that. But at the end, it never ends growing, housing rents. So it seems that the potential ground rent always goes up and up and up, especially amidst a financialized scenario where demand is being leveraged by more and more banking system and so on and so on. So I don't know if you get my question, but my question is about whether one can use the concept of closing the rent gap, or maybe the rent gap never closes. Thank you very much, Selim, for your fantastic work.
Thank you, Ernesto, for the kind words and also the interesting comment question mixture. So I would, let's say, partially agree on the first one. I think the toolbox, let's say, that is in the paper would actually allow to really disentangle the contributions from location factors and immediate, like, physical housing qualities on the property very well. But it's not, the model as I set it up is not fully designed to really focus on that, to kind of give a number to both things and directly compare. However, this could be implemented with a small tweak, I think, by just putting more explicit location modeling of different factors, like different amenities and stuff like this into the model, and then coming up with a little bit modified index definitions. But I think this is actually one way where one could draw on the recent paper and kind of push things even further. Maybe have even a better theoretical grounding and connection to the rent gap theory, and to kind of move away from this just saying that we don't actually observe those ground rents directly, but we observe kind of these closing mechanisms. So this would be, I think, a very interesting route to go down to in the future. With respect to the second question on does the rent gap ever close? Very good question. I would definitely agree that it definitely opens up again and again. However, since currently the paper does provide just tools to measure kind of implications of the closing, we kind of cannot say if now the rent gap opened up again or the closing was not fully successful. But I mean, we can surely say that the transformations observed moved things in the direction of a closing, but there might also be other factors at play that move or open the spread between the potential and the actual ground rent up again as well. So I think this is always on the move, and transformation will therefore again and again happen in different forms in different places. So yeah, I guess this is, opens up also the demand for our research, because if the rent gap is closed once and forever, then we're also out of business.
Thank you, Selim.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Yeah, we have one question from Leo Chen. Let me just hello.
Hi guys, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, hi Selim, hi Yumpong, hi Ernesto, hi everyone. Okay, so I should apologize first because I just got cold and my voice is getting raucous. Almost lost my voice, and I'll try to make it clear. Okay, so I got a set of questions. First, thank you for your impressive presentation, and I think it's quite interesting. And first, you mentioned that you just use the hedonic model to calculate the quality adjusted rental price. So my first question is, how do you operationalize the quality? So it's the kind of like a variable in your data set, or you just do some kind of like work to operationalize it? So that's my first question. And second one is, I noticed that you use two kind of like rand gaps or proxies for rand gap. The first one is the index gap, and the second one is Fisher index. And I'm just wondering, according to your observation, which proxy is better, and why why is better? Because I sort of like lost when you were talking about, when you were discussing the two proxies. So can you tell us a bit more about? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well aware, I covered a lot of ground, both in the paper and the presentation. So I try to clarify a few things, and let me maybe reshare my screen for that. So can you see the variable list here? Yes. So basically, when I talk about different housing quality factors, the factors I use to calibrate, to estimate the regression model are listed here. And so these are the factors that I can actively consider. Of course, there are more housing quality factors that do exist, but I can only use them if I have some kind of data available for them. So basically, what I can do is I can control for different sizes of flats. I can control for different difference in old versus rather new buildings. I can control for if the flat has a balcony, or the building has an elevator. If there is a cellar that comes with the housing unit, if there is a garage, if there is a good heating system, if we have a second bathroom, things like this. Those factors are very common variables, I'd say, in this hedonic regression context. but of course, there might be factors that I don't observe, and then I cannot control for, unfortunately. And with respect to the second question, which is kind of the better proxy for the rent gap, if I understood correctly, then again, it's very important to distinguish here. Both indices are not meant directly as proxies for the rent gap itself. It's just that, I say, in the context of rental sector gentrification that is driven by rent gaps, two things need to occur to close the rent gap there. The first thing is we need a qualitative transformation that is price effective, and this is measured by the index gap, just this factor. And then the other thing is we need to have this transformation actually lead to an increase in prices and thereby a decline in affordability, which is then measured by the Fisher index. We could, for the price, also use the mean index or any other classical price index in theory, I'd say. So both indices are relevant. They measure different things. None of them directly measures the rent gap, just the implication of a rent gap triggered transformation in the rental market.
Okay, so
Yeah.
can I ask a further question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your answer. And my further question is, so you said that the index gap and a Fisher index, there are two components to measure or to you know the prerequisite for gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So according to your observation, which one is, carries more weight in determining gentrification? Because I just saw that you just show us two pictures. That's the trend for the index gap and Fisher index. So, and we can see some sort of like a turning point. And according to my observation, it seems like the index gap maybe got a more significant increase in the trend. So does it mean it carries more weight in determining the gentrification? Thank you.
I think this is a question that cannot be answered by looking at the data, but it's a conceptual question. Again, my argument is both aspects, namely the transformation and the price increase, are relevant. Otherwise, we cannot really have rental sector gentrification, because if we just do a transformation and prices are not rising, then nobody will be displaced. And otherwise, if prices rise and affordability declines, but this has nothing to do with any physical transformation of the environment, then it doesn't match our initial definition of gentrification, at least the one I was using by Clark here. So both aspects are important, and actually directly comparing the index numbers also doesn't really make too much sense, because they're a bit differently scaled. So I wouldn't really do that. Again, the main point is both factors need to be at play. However, I would say one could make the argument that solely looking at the index gap already gives us a lot of information about gentrification, dynamics across the city. However, we have the problem that we could theoretically have a high index gap number, but still the area is quite affordable nonetheless. I'm not sure if that happens empirically often, but I'd say it's theoretically possible. Yeah. So, but definitely this is the more innovative part of the study, let's say, and I think the application of the Fisher index on a neighborhood level is a not often done, but not really innovative thing to do, let's say.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, do we see any more questions? No, I don't think so. Can I just ask one quick follow-up question? Because
Sure.
You mentioned that qualitative transformation is somehow kind of prerequisite for gentrification. Is that very specific to Vienna, or do you consider it to be kind of universal if we want to somehow scale up the kind of index gap and transfer to understand other contexts? In other lectures, like in the case of Hungary, for instance, in the Budapest case, correct me if I'm wrong, Ernesto. The speaker was talking about the kind of rental housing as well, but then it doesn't actually require any kind of investment in these housing to flip it for tourism consumption, for instance. But then there's still some sort of gentrification occurring, but then the kind of qualitative transformation of the housing simply doesn't follow. So I'm just curious, the kind of assumption, is that very specific to Vienna?
No, my argument is indeed a more universal one here. And unfortunately, I've not heard the talk from the colleagues. So I'm a bit hesitant to directly comment on it. But again, my argument is basically in the definition of gentrification I use, a key component is that there is a physical transformation of the built environment. A pure kind of change in use. One could say this is more like a tenure conversion in kind of those differentiation I used earlier. So it's definitely an interesting case, and it would definitely relate somehow the rent gap framework to kind of displacement and socio-spatial outcomes. But I think the line of argumentation is a very different one to what I'm using here. And I would be inclined to say that it doesn't fully fit the definition of gentrification I used. So again, there are many different definitions, so it depends there. But I think that a kind of physical transformation is always a component in this understanding of gentrification. And of course, gentrification is not the only way by which I don't know, housing markets and socio-spatial inequality in the urban context are related. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I follow the question, Yunpeng?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and the answer by Selim is also quite insightful. As you were referring to Hungary, Budapest, the city of Budapest, where no, on average, of course, no investment is needed to collect a potential ground rent. This is why Matthias Berndt or Gergely Old, the author of the paper we included in the special issue on Budapest, they claim this is commodification gap, because they believe they see institutional contexts lots of regulation, and of course the post-socialist environment that commodifies housing, but no investment is needed to collect higher rents. So that drives me to reflect maybe a necessary condition for the rent gap, not for gentrification, is that there must be reinvestment. So, or maybe not, who knows? But I think that's something to reflect about. Are we talking about the same thing when we talk about rent gap and gentrification, or maybe we talk about different things? And I recommend reading Eric Clark's, one of his last papers about calling to disentangle gentrification and rent gap. Anyway, I think this is a super tiny aspect of the discussion, but I think it's a relevant one. And anyway, I agree with you that gentrification in most of the cases is about reinvestment and upgrading, physical upgrading. But it seems that there are some few cases that's not the case.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it appears as if the kind of commodification gap framework could be more useful in the Budapest case, which is actually like physically quite close to Vienna, but I guess the housing market has a very different structure. However, I would say that also in Vienna, a commodification gap definitely plays a role, regardless of what we're seeing here. So I think also in Vienna we have a certain depressing factor of the private rents through a rental market integration mechanism, where actually especially the social housing segments and especially the cooperative housing segment kind of takes up a lot of the demand pressure and is to a certain degree able to have a depressing effect on the private rents. But this doesn't mean that there is no rent gap closing at all happening. It's my interpretation would be that just this, it could be much larger if this commodification gap is actually removed.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is a very good start for discussion because Tom Sigler is also going to share his methodological approach to kind of measuring the kind of rent gap, but in the short-term rental sector, using the example from Australia this Thursday. And so thank you again for your very interesting talk, and also many thanks for the audience who stay with us for the discussion. Yeah, thank you, and hopefully we will see you again in the next lecture.
Great. Thank you for the invitation, and see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Selim. Bye-bye, Yunpeng. See you in the
Bye.
next one.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.